The forest glowed with colors that had no names in any human language, and Dr. Linnea Voss walked through it like a ghost afraid to disturb the dead. She had been on Vareth 7 for 11 days now, and every single one of those days had taught her something new about being careful, about being small even when you were the largest thing for miles round, about watching where you placed your feet when entire civilizations might live beneath a single fallen leaf. Her boots were specially designed for this kind of work, soft-soled and lightweight, and she moved with the patience of someone who had learned the hard way. That first contact was not about being first but about being kind. The bioluminescent fungi towered above her in some places, their caps spreading wide like umbrellas made of living light, and in other places they barely reached her knees, forming carpets of gentle blue and purple that pulsed with a rhythm she had come to think of as the heartbeat of this world somewhere. In this forest lived the Cathrith. Preliminary surveys had found them 3 years ago, a species of tiny hunters standing no more than 4 inches tall, with bodies that looked like insects, but minds that built cities and wrote songs, and went to war over matters of honor that humans could barely understand. Linnea had read every report, studied every image, memorized every scrap of data the unmanned probes had gathered, and still she was not prepared for the weight of responsibility that pressed down on her shoulders. Every time she took a stupidly wrong move and she could destroy a family, crush a home, and a story that had been unfolding for thousands of years before humans ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. So she moved slowly, and she moved carefully, and she pretended not to notice when something watched her from the shadows. Kethri had been observing her since day 3. She knew this because her suit had sensors that could detect a heartbeat from 50 meters away, and because she had spent 20 years learning to feel when eyes were upon her, and because sometimes when the wind shifted just right, she could hear the faint clicking sounds of their language carried on the breeze like whispers from another world. They were afraid of her, and they had every right to beto them. She was a monster from the sky, a giant who had descended from the heavens in a roaring ship of fire and metal, and now she wandered through their sacred forests taking samples of their soil and recording images of their homes. Tried to show them she meant no harm when she found a stream. She did not walk through it but went around, even when going around added an hour to her journey, because she had seen the tiny bridges the Kethri built across running water, and she would not destroy in seconds what had taken them months to create. When she ate her ration bar, she was careful to catch every crumb, because food from another world might be poison to creatures so small, and because leaving trash in someone else's home was rude no matter how big or small you were. When she slept, she chose bare rock over soft ground, because soft ground might be someone's garden or someone's grave or someone's place of prayer. And slowly, so slowly, she hoped they were beginning to understand. Their young Kethri hunters crouched in the hollow of a mushroom cap and watched the giant sit down to rest, and none of them could agree on what they were seeing. Victa was the oldest and the most careful, her carapace a deep green that helped her vanish into the forest shadows, and she believed the giant was simply too stupid to notice the world around her, too large and too slow to see what she was stepping on. Sorel was the middle one, his shell patterned with stripes of gold and black that marked him as a tracker born, and he thought the giant was hunting something, waiting for prey to reveal itself before she struck. Bryn was the youngest and the most reckless, barely old enough to carry a hunting spear, and he did not know what he believed anymore, because nothing about this giant matched the stories he had grown up hearing. Stories said giants were destroyers who came from the sky to burn forests and poison water and take whatever they wanted without a skink. Stories said giants could not feel pain or mercy or love. Stories said if you ever saw a giant you should run and hide and pray to the old gods that it would not find you. But this giant had stopped walking yesterday to let a family of crawlers cross her path, standing so still for so long that Bryn had thought she might have died on her feet. And when the crawlers had finally passed, she had smiled and continued on her way. Giants were not supposed to smell. Victa clicked her mandibles in the way. That meant she had made a decision, and her two companions leaned closer to hear what she had to say. They had been watching for 3 days, she reminded them, and they had learned nothing that would earn them their warrior marks, nothing that would make the elders take them seriously. Nothing that would prove they were ready to join the adult hunters on the great expeditions. Beyond the forest edge, but there was one thing they could do. One act so brave and so foolish that no Kethri had ever attempted it. Before they could board the Jonsril made a sound of disbelief, and Bryn felt his heart begin to race in his chest. But Victor was already explaining her plan in quick, sharp clicks that left no room for argument. The giant carried a shell on her back, a container of some kind that she opened and closed throughout the day, and there were gaps in its teeth where 3 small hunters could slip inside and hide when the giant returned to wherever giants went when they left this world. They would go with her, and they would see things no Kethri had ever seen, and they would return with knowledge that would make them legends, or they would die, which would also make them legends. Just in a different and less pleasant way, Bryn looked at the giant sitting peacefully in the distance. Her strange, soft face turned up toward the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. And he made his choice. He would go, because he was young, and because he was foolish, and because somewhere deep in his small, fierce heart he wanted to know if the stories were wrong, if giants could be something other than monsters, if the universe was bigger and stranger, and more wonderful than anyone had ever told him. Tomorrow they would become the first Kethri to touch the sky. Tonight they would sharpen their spears and say goodbye to everything they knew. The sun rose over Vareth 7 like a slow orange fire spreading across the sky, and Linnea Voss began her morning the same way she began every morning on an alien world, with a quiet prayer that today would not be the day. She ruined everything. She ate her breakfast sitting on a flat rock beside a stream that sang with a voice like tiny bells, and she watched the forest wake up around her with the patient eyes of someone who had learned that the best way to see was often to stay still. Her mission was simple in theory and impossibly complex in practice. Document the ecosystem, map the terrain, observe the indigenous species without interfering, and above all else to no harm. 12 years of training had prepared her for the science, but nothing could truly prepare anyone for the weight of being the first human to walk on soil where thinking beings had built their lives. Finished her breakfast and stood up slowly, brushing crumbs from her suit into her collection pouch, because leaving trash behind was not something she would ever do. And then she reached for her backpack where it leaned against the rock. Beside her the pack was standard issue for long-range planetary surveys, a gray and green container with multiple pockets and compartments designed to carry everything a xenobiologist might need for weeks in the field. It felt slightly different, though she could not have explained why if someone had asked. Hirsch lifted it onto her shoulders and adjusted the straps, and began walking along the stream toward the coordinates where she had planned to take soil samples, and she tried to ignore the way the fine hairs on the back of her neck were standing up like they did when something was watching her, because something was watching her, and it was not watching from the forest. This time it was watching from inside her pack. 3 hunters had made their move just before dawn, climbing the outside of the giant's shell while she slept with a silence that would have made their ancestors proud. Victa had gone first with a rope made of silk spider thread tied around her waist, her claws finding holds in the fabric that covered the container. And when she reached the top, she had anchored the rope so the others could follow. Sorrel had come next, his tracker eyes scanning every surface for danger, his mandibles pressed tightly together to keep himself from making any sound that might wake the sleeping monster. Bryn had come last, because he was the youngest and because someone had to cut the rope behind them so no one would see how they had entered. No, they huddled together in a canyon of strange materials, surrounded by objects so alien they had no words to describe what they were seeing. A flat rectangle that glowed with a cold blue light and made humming sounds like a hive of dream beasts. A cylinder that smelled like water but was made of something neither metal nor stone nor wood. Thin sheets of material covered in markings that might have been writing, or might have been magic, or might have been something the Kethri would never understand. And everywhere, there was the warmth that radiated from the walls of the container and seeped up through the floor and wrapped around them like a blanket made of sunlight. And despite their fear, all 3 hunters found themselves relaxing in ways they had not expected. This was not the cold, dead shell of a monster. This was something else, something almost like a home outside the pack. Linnea walked and tried to decide what to do. Her suit's sensors had detected the moment the 3 small beings entered her pack, had measured their heartbeats and body temperatures, and given her a detailed analysis of their probable species and physical condition 3K3. All young, all healthy, all carrying small weapons that could not possibly hurt her, but could certainly hurt each other. If they panicked, protocol was clear about situations like this, was supposed to secure any unauthorized contact with indigenous life forms, document the encounter thoroughly, and call for guidance from the Oversight Committee before taking any further action. But protocol had been written by people who had never looked into the eyes of a frightened child, and Linnea had been looking into frightened eyes her whole career. If she opened the pack now and reached inside, 3 young hunters would see a giant hand descending toward them from the sky. They would fight, or they would run, or they would freeze in terror. And no matter what they did, the story they brought home would be a story about monsters, a story about the day the giant tried to grab them, and they barely escaped with their lives. But if she waited, if she let them observe and explore and learn on their own terms, then maybe the story would be different. Maybe the story would be about curiosity instead of fear. Maybe the story would be about discovery instead of danger. Maybe the story would be about 3 brave hunters who touched the sky and found something wonderful. She made her decision without really making it, the way she had made every important decision in her life, by listening to the small quiet voice inside her chest that always seemed to know what was right, even when her brain was still arguing with itself. She would pretend she did not know. She would walk a little more slowly and a little more carefully than usual, and she would leave the outer pocket of her pack unzipped so they would have plenty of air, and she would take the long way back to her base camp so they would have time to see what they wanted to see. And when they fell asleep, because they would fall asleep eventually, because even the bravest hunters could not stay awake forever, she would figure out what to do next. Inside the pack, Bryn crept toward the edge of the opening where light leaked in through a gap in the teeth that held the shell closet. He told himself he was scouting, gathering information that would help them survive. But the truth was simpler and more embarrassing than they wanted to see her. Faceti stories described giants as having faces like nightmares, all teeth and anger and hunger that could never be satisfied. But when he reached the gap and pressed one eye against it, he saw something completely different. He saw a face that looked tired and a little sad and very, very careful. A face that watched the ground and the trees and the sky with the same gentle attention his mother used when she was checking on her garden. She saw a face that was humming a strange, soft song, a melody that rose and fell like wind through leaves. And even though he could not understand the words, he understood the feeling behind them. It was a lonely sound, the kind of sound someone made when they had been alone for too long and had forgotten that anyone might be listening. Engines were not supposed to be. Lone Libran pulled back from the gap and found Victa and Sorrel watching him with questions in their eyes, and he did not know what to tell them because he did not know what he had seen. Only knew that something had changed, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The afternoon stretched long and golden across the forest floor, and Linnea Voss walked like someone who had nowhere in particular to. Bethis was not true, of course, because she had a schedule to keep and samples to collect and a base camp that was now 3 hours away instead of 1. But she had decided that today the schedule could wait. She had 3 passengers who did not know. She knew they were there, and she wanted to give them time to look around and explore and understand that not every large thing in the universe wanted to hurt them. Time to see a human being up close and realize that the monster from their stories was just a person trying not to step on anyone. Time to learn that the sky was not as scary as they had been taught to believe. So she walked slowly, and she hummed old songs her grandmother used to sing, and she pretended to be fascinated by every flower and every stone and every interesting patch of moss she happened to pass. Path she chose wound through the prettiest parts of the forest, past waterfalls that fell like curtains of silver and clearings where the bioluminescent mushrooms grew so thick the ground seemed to be made of living light. She stopped often to take readings and make notes in her data pad, not because she needed the readings, but because stopping gave her passengers a chance to rest and look around without being jostled by her movement. And she sat down beside a pool of crystal clear water and took out a ration bar, and she ate it so slowly and so carefully that any observer would have thought She was performing some kind of ritual instead of just having lunch inside the pack. The 3 hunters watched everything with eyes that grew wider by the horror they saw the giant step over a fallen log instead of through it. Even though going through would have been faster and easier, they saw her pause at the edge of a meadow and wait for something small and quick to finish crossing before she continued on her way. They saw her find a nest of crawlers in her path and change direction completely, rather than disturb their home, adding what must have been a great distance to her journey. Just to avoid causing harm, Victa was the first to speak, her voice barely louder than a whisper, because she was still afraid the giant might hear them. Even though logic said that was impossible, this does not match the stories. She clicked, and her mandibles trembled with something that might have been confusion or might have been the beginning of doubt. Sorrel agreed with a quick nod of his head, his tracker eyes still fixed on the gap where daylight leaked through. She moves like a hunter, he said, but not like a hunter who is hunting. More like a hunter who is trying not to be hunted. Like she is afraid of something we cannot see. They both looked at Bryn, but Bryn did not say anything because Bryn was thinking about the giant's face and the lonely song she had been humming, and the way she smiled at small creatures she could have crushed without even noticing. Was thinking about his mother and the stories she used to tell him before he slept. Stories about the dark times when giants walked the world and brought nothing but death and fire and sorrow. Those stories were supposed to be history, supposed to be truth passed down through generations, so that the Kethri would never forget the danger that lurked beyond the skybit. What if the stories were wrong? What if the stories were just stories? Tales told by frightened people who had never actually met a giant. Fears passed down so many times that everyone had forgotten. They started as guesses. Instead of facts, the giant stopped walking and sat down with her back against a tree. And from inside the pack, the 3 hunters felt the world tilt and settle as she made herself comfortable. She was resting again, which meant they could move around without fear of being thrown against the walls. Victa immediately began exploring the deeper parts of the container, searching for anything that might tell them more about where they were going and what awaited them there. Sorrel stayed near the opening, keeping watch in case the giant decided to reach inside. His spear held ready, even though they all knew a spear would do nothing against something so large. Bryn crawled toward a corner where something soft and warm was piled up like a nest, and when he touched it, he realized it was cloth of some kind, finer and smoother than any cloth the Kethri knew how to make. Pressed his face against it and breathed in, and the smell that filled his head was strange but not unpleasant, like flowers he had never seen and places he had never been, and a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. This was where she slept. He realized the small soft nest inside the shell she carried on her back, and suddenly the giant seemed less like a monster and more like a traveler far from home. He had felt that way once, when he was very young and had wandered too far from the village and spent a night alone in the forest, curled up in a hollow log and wishing desperately for the familiar smells of his mother's house. The giant was alone too. He understood now, alone in a forest that was not her forest, on a world that was not her world, carrying her home on her back, because she had no other home to go. Togians were not supposed to be travelerstians, were not supposed to be lone legends, were not supposed to be anything like him, but this one was. And Bryn did not know what to do with that knowledge, so he just lay there in the soft cloth and listened to the steady thunder of the giant's heartbeat through the walls of the container. It was a good sound, he decided, slow and strong and reliable, like the drums the elders played during the harvest festival outside the pack. Linnea closed her eyes and let herself rest for a few minutes, and she thought about the 3 small hearts beating inside her pack and wondered what they were thinking and feeling and learning. Hoped they were learning something good. Hoped they were learning that the universe was not as frightening as it seemed. Hoped they were learning that sometimes the things you fear the most turn out to be the things you needed to fin. Sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, and Linnea stood up and continued walking toward the place where 3 young hunters would need to decide what to believe about giants. The stars came out one by one like eyes opening in the darkness, and inside the giant's pack 3 exhausted hunters finally lost their battle against sleep. They had been awake for nearly 2 days, running on fear and excitement and the desperate energy that comes from doing something impossibly brave. But even the bravest hunters have limits, and theirs had been reached. Ours Victa fell asleep first, which surprised no one, because Victa had been the one doing most of the thinking and planning and worrying, and all of that work had drained her faster than she wanted to admit. She curled up in a corner, near the glowing rectangle, her hunting spear still clutched in her claws, her antennae twitching occasionally as dreams moved through her mind. Sorrel lasted a little longer, because Sorrel was a tracker, and trackers were trained to stay alert even when their bodies screamed for rest. But eventually his golden eyes grew too heavy to keep open, and he slumped against a wall of fabric and let the darkness take him. Bryn was the last one awake, lying in the soft nest of cloth that smelled like flowers and faraway places, and he watched his two friends sleep and felt the gentle sway of the giants walking, and listened to the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. Tried to stay awake, because someone should keep watch, because that was what hunters did when they were in dangerous territory. But the warmth was so comfortable, and the sound of the heartbeat was so soothing, and his eyes were so very, very tired. Just a moment, he told himself. Just a moment of rest, and then he would get up and take over the watch from wherever Sorrel had left off. But a moment turned into minutes, and minutes turned into something deeper, and before he knew what was happening, Bryn was asleep with his face pressed against cloth that smelled like a home he had never known outside the pack. Linnea felt the last small movement go still, and she smiled even though no one was watching. She had been waiting for this, walking in patient circles for the past hour, because her sensors told her the 3 little heartbeats were slowing down and she wanted them to be comfortable. When they finally gave in to exhaustion, they were asleep, and now she had a decision to make. The responsible thing to do would be to contact her oversight committee and report the situation and ask for guidance on how to proceed with this unexpected first contact. Scientific thing to do would be to document everything, take scans and measurements and samples, and add 3 fascinating specimens to the data she would bring back to headquarters. Human thing to do was something else entirely. Linnea stopped walking and knelt down in a clearing where the bioluminescent moss glowed soft blue beneath her knees, and she carefully, so carefully, slipped the pack off her shoulders and set it on the ground in front of her. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the zipper, not because she was afraid of what she would find, but because she was afraid of what she might do wrong. On sudden movement, one unexpected sound, and she could traumatize these young hunters forever. Only thoughtless action, and she could undo everything they had spent the last day learning about. John, she opened the pack with the patience of someone diffusing a bomb, one tooth at a time, letting air and starlight leak in so slowly that the change would be almost invisible to anyone inside. When the opening was wide enough, she leaned forward and looked in, and what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. 3 tiny hunters, curled up together in a pile like puppies or kittens or any other small creatures, who had found safety in each other's warmth. Their hunting spears were still in their hands, but loosely now, the way a child holds a stick they brought to bed, because it made them feel brave. Their carapaces glowed faintly in the starlight, green and gold and a deep iridescent blue that reminded Linnea of peacock feathers. Of them, the smallest one had buried his face in her spare shirt like it was a pillow, and his antennae moved gently with each breath he took. They were so small and so fierce and so impossibly precious that Linnea felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She had spent her whole career studying alien life forms, cataloging species across a dozen worlds, writing papers that would be read by scientists for generations to come. But none of that had prepared her for this moment. None of that had prepared her to look at 3 sleeping children and feel her heart crack open like an egg, because that was what they were. She realized children playing at being warriors, young people trying to prove themselves to a world that demanded bravery. Even when bravery was terrifying, she knew that feeling. She had been that feeling once, a long time ago, when she was young and desperate to prove that she belonged among the stars, even though everyone said she was too soft for the work, too gentle for a job that required hard choices and harder sacrifices. She had shown them they were wrong, but showing them had cost her something, had turned her into someone who followed protocols and kept her distance and never let herself get too close to the life forms she was supposed to be. Studying Gundle now until 3 small hunters crawled into her pack and fell asleep in her spare shirt and reminded her why she had wanted to explore the stars in the first place, not for the science, not for the glory, not for the papers and the awards and the respect of her colleague, as for this, for moments like this, for the chance to look at something strange and wonderful and realize that the universe was full of small brave creatures trying to find their way home. Sh did not touch them, sh did not skin them or document them or do anything that a proper xenobiologist was supposed to do in a situation like this. Just looked, and she let herself feel everything she had been trained not to feel, and she made a silent promise to 3 sleeping hunters who would never know she had made it. Sh would get them home. Safish would give them a story worth telling. Sh would be the giant they deserved, the one from stories that had not been written yet, the one their children and grandchildren would hear about when they asked what lay beyond the sky. Sh zipped the pack closed with the same infinite patience she had used to open it, and she lifted it onto her shoulders and stood up and looked toward the horizon, where the Kethri village waited. It was time to go home. The Kethri village glowed like a constellation that had fallen from the sky and decided to stay, and Linnea Voss stood at the edge of the forest and watched its lights flicker through the darkness. Had walked through the night to get here, following paths she had mapped on her first day on this world, moving so smoothly that her 3 passengers had not woken once. She was close enough to hear the faint sounds of life drifting through the trees, clicks and chirps, and the distant thump of drums that meant something. She would probably never understand. This was as far as she would go. Any closer, and she risked being seen by the village guards, risked causing a panic that might undo everything she had spent the last day trying to build. Sh found a spot where the moss grew thick and soft, 100 meters from the nearest Kethri structure, and she knelt down with her pack cradled in her arms like something infinitely precious. The zipper made no sound as she opened it, because she had practiced this movement 1,000 times in training, had learned to be silent the way a shadow is silent, the way a thought is silent, the way the space between stars is silent. She tilted the pack so that the opening faced the village, and the ground inside was level with the forest floor. And then she set it down and backed away slowly, never taking her eyes off the small gap where 3 hunters would soon emerge. 30 paces. That was the distance she had decided on. Far enough that she would not loom over them when they woke. Close enough that they would know she was there. She sat down with her back against a tree, and her hands resting open on her knees, palms up, the universal gesture of someone who was not holding a weapon. And then she waited inside the pack. Bryn was the first to wacka, opened his eyes to darkness and warmth and the familiar smell of cloth that had become strangely comforting over the past day. And for a long confused moment he did not remember where he was or how he had gotten there. Effin' memory came flooding back like water through a broken dam, and he sat up so fast he nearly hit his head on something solid above him. The mission, the climb, the hours spent hiding inside the giant's shell while she walked through the forest, the dreams he had been having about heartbeats and lonely songs and faces that were not as frightening as he had expected them to be. Reached out in the darkness and found Victor's arm, shook it gently until she woke with a start, and a click of alarm. Thrill woke on his own a moment later, his tracker instincts pulling him from sleep at the first sign that something had changed. They huddled together in the darkness and tried to understand what was happening, because something was definitely happening. They could feel it in the air and hear it in the sounds that leaked through the walls of the container. Those sounds were familiar. Those sounds were home. Victor crept toward the opening first, her spear held ready, her eyes adjusting to the light that streamed in from outside. What she saw made her freeze so completely that Sorrel and Bryn nearly crashed into her from behind. The opening of the container faced their village, faced the glowing lights and the familiar structures and the life they had left behind. When they decided to touch the sky, and 30 paces away, sitting perfectly still against a tree with her hands open on her knees, the giant watched them with eyes that held no anger and no hunger and no threat. Knew. Victor realized with a shock that ran through her whole body like lightning. She knew we were here the whole time. She had always known. 3 hunters emerged from the pack slowly, their spears raised more out of habit than genuine fear, their eyes moving between the giant and the village and the impossible distance. Between the two they were home, but they had not walked home, had not escaped or fought their way free or done any of the heroic things the stories said. Heroes were supposed a dove giant had brought them here. The giant had carried them through the night while they slept, had found their village without being told where it was, had set them down facing the lights of home, like a parent returning lost children to their bedswee. Bryn whispered, and he did not realize he had said it out loud until Victa and Sorrel turned to look at Himwe. Did she bring us back? Why did she not keep us? Why did she not do any of the things? Giants are supposed to do. No one had an answer. The giant did not move, did not speak, did not do anything except sit there with her hands open and her eyes soft and a small sad smile. On her strange flat face, Bryn made a decision. He lowered his spear and walked forward, ignoring the hissed warnings from Victa, ignoring every instinct that screamed at him to run and hide and never look back. Walked until he was standing in the open space between the pack and the tree, close enough to see the way starlight reflected in the giant's eyes, close enough to see that those eyes were wet with something that looked like tear sand. Then he raised one hand, palm out, in the gesture his people used to acknowledge someone who had proven themselves worthy of respect. It was not a greeting for strangers. It was not a gesture for enemies or monsters or things to be feared. It was what you offered to an equal, to someone who had shown you something true about themselves, to someone you would not forget as long as you lived. The giant's smile grew wider, and a single tear rolled down her cheek, and she raised her own hand in return. Huge and strange and impossibly gentle. He stayed like that for a long moment, the tiny hunter and the giant from the sky, speaking without words in a language that needed no translation. Then Bryn lowered his hand and turned and walked back to his friends, and together the three hunters made their way toward the glowing lights of home. Linnea watched them go until they vanished into the darkness, three small figures carrying a story that would change their world forever. In her report the next morning she wrote minimal contact with indigenous species and no incidents of concern, and she did not mention the tears she had cried or the promise she had made or the small hand that had been raised to greet her as an equal. Some things were not meant for reports. Some things were just meant to be remembered years later. When the Kethri finally made formal contact with humanity, they would tell a legend about three young hunters who touched the sky and found not monsters, but kindness, not death, but a gentle hand that carried them home while they slept. And somewhere in the archives of the Terran Frontier Corps, an old xenobiologist would read about that legend and smile, because she had always known that the best stories were the ones you never had to write down, ones that wrote themselves in the hearts of everyone they touched.